and I've got the
Yeah,
clicker.
I think I was in Houston with you about 9 or 10 months ago. I think we hit this topic. It'll be the same slides, but hopefully we've learned a little bit since then on this topic. And I don't have any disclosures on this. So Joe, this particular, I know you're controlling the slides. This particular slides, it kind of goes line by line a lot on this one. And so just kind of watch
Yes,
where
sir.
I'm at, and you'll see what happens. But before we talk about goal-directed perfusion, when I put this lecture together, I wanted to catch as many fish in this sea as possible, and start with a broad net for people's wherever their understanding is, or maybe they don't even really know what goal-directed perfusion is. In fact, I think there's still quite a few people that don't. I have come to learn that a lot of the schools, perfusion schools, are teaching this, and probably have been for a handful of years at least. And we're really undergoing a paradigm shift to the way we perfuse patients. And I think 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to have a lot of delivery of oxygen, goal-directed perfusion going on in the way we perfuse patients. But what is traditional perfusion to start with, so we can understand what goal-directed perfusion means? And traditional perfusion techniques, gauge adequate perfusion according to body surface area and bypass temperature. And this is something almost all of us do all the time. And this has been shown to achieve a high delivery of oxygen in about 50% of cases, which means 50%, maybe not. So I took a little, survey on this, and if any of you are inclined to do this, just find 5 or 10 of your perfusion colleagues and ask them, can they define, or what do they think goal-directed perfusion is? And when I did this 9 or 10 months ago, I was surprised. I really couldn't define it perfectly myself, and I was surprised to find out that an awful lot of people really couldn't define it either. So I didn't feel so bad, but you can ask that. And so some people said to me, well, it's AMSEC's standards and guidelines. And so the AMSEC's guidelines, the American Society of Extracorporeal Technology that we all know, they've created standards and guidelines based on clinical evidence and currently accepted perfusion practices. The document that they have is intended to serve as a guide for teams to develop institution-specific protocols and improve their reliability, safety, and effectiveness of their extracorporeal support services. AMSEC recommends that clinical teams use their document as a guide only for developing institution-specific protocols for their patients receiving extracorporeal support. So the answer to this is no, goal-directed perfusion is not AMSEC standards and guidelines. Well, some people said, well, it's evidence-based medicine. And that's a pretty good guess. I'm not going to answer that one right now. We're going to come back to it. But that one's getting a little bit warmer. So here's a generic definition, and this is my personal words based on all the research I did, and collaborated with a lot of people who did know what it was. But the generic definition that you could take home is of goal-directed perfusion is it's providing the optimal clinical techniques, methods, and pharmaceutical treatments available to us to ensure adequate delivery of oxygen, nutrients, and fluid balance to the tissues in a clinical setting whereby the patient is no longer physiologically capable of doing so on his own. So let's do a little bit more specific definition of goal-directed perfusion. Goal-directed perfusion during bypass focuses on perfusion techniques that have been verified to achieve a high delivery of oxygen to the tissues with a consequential reduction in various ischemic-related complications. And traditionally, it's had a particular focus on reducing acute kidney injury, but it does not have to be. It can be focused on a number of things, which we're going to talk about. So how does goal-directed perfusion research studies differ from traditional research? And this is really interesting, Joe, because traditional research studies basically take a particular setting, a particular clinical or laboratory setting, and they observe the data, and they collect the data, and they strive to learn or draw conclusions from that information that they collect. And goal-directed perfusion studies, on the other hand, perform specific perfusion strategies in order to achieve a specific targeted goal. And then they assess the degree to which they were able to obtain this targeted goal. We're going to talk about this more elaborately. So getting back to, is goal-directed perfusion evidence-based medicine? Well, evidence-based practice is any practice that relies on scientific evidence for their guidance and decision-making. Practices that are not evidence-based may rely more on tradition, intuition, one's own education, or even some unproven methods. Therefore, goal-directed perfusion and evidence-based medicine practices most certainly overlap one another and are in many ways closely connected. So now, as I said, goal-directed perfusion has its backbone and its roots in delivery of oxygen, but it can be targeted, and you could have a targeted goal for many different things. And some of these things would include targeting specific hemoglobin or hematocrit results or levels, managing fluid balance and nutrition in a certain ways, managing your electrolyte balance and maybe even your blood pressure, controlling and managing your SVR and PVR, your vascular resistance, managing and controlling your blood osmolarity and protein content. You can target and manage your oxygen content of the blood, as we said, but also blood flow, cardiac output. You can manage and target arterial venous oxygen saturations and PO2s and lactate levels. But as I said, largely, and still a lot of the focus still focuses on the delivery of oxygen and, by the way, the amount of carbon dioxide produced. So we're going to look at that a lot today. So what was the premise of goal-directed perfusion and how it really came to be? Well, high oxygen delivery, DO2, during cardiopulmonary bypass is associated with better renal outcomes, less ischemic-related complications, and shorter ICU stays. But what is the best means of achieving it, and how is it determined?
John, may I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so, and this is something that's very interesting to me, and I don't want to lose the thought. I'm already writing down a bunch of questions, but on this particular slide, you look at, you say that high DO2 during CPB is associated with better renal outcomes. Is that because, and I think you discussed this in one of your previous lectures, that in the glomerulus, the PO2 is so low that if you're not giving it what it needs, you have basically an ischemic kidney?
Right, and we're going to show a couple diagrams about that. And this is really what gave
I got ahead of you, I'm sorry.
It gave birth to the concept of goal-directed perfusion with delivery of oxygen, especially because AKI incidence is actually pretty high when you really look at it on cardiopulmonary bypass. And going back till about the year 2000, and I'm going to talk about three in particular, really the fathers of this whole concept and all the work that they've done in the last 20 years. And when they were really concerned about the low oxygen content levels that naturally exist in the kidney, and then started thinking, well, all this AKI that we see, and not only on perfusion, by the way, in sepsis and a lot of other things, maybe we should really be focusing on how much oxygen we can be delivering to the tissues. And the most sensitive, and the one that they felt would give them the most immediate gratification and data, was to look at, can we affect acute kidney injury? And they were right on when they did that. And it's turned out to be huge development in our field and in and outside of the field of perfusion, actually, when it comes to AKI.
I'll be interested to hear about it.
So did we skip a slide? I'm not sure if you go back one just for a second. Yeah, so go ahead. Yeah, you're good. All right, so go ahead. And so now what is delivery of oxygen? Let's first of all try to define this. So it's oxygen delivery is defined as the amount of oxygen delivered to the capillaries or to the tissues per minute. Well, how is it determined? Well, it has to be calculated in some way. Now, I don't necessarily say you have to do it manually, but you can do it manually. You might have an app that can do it. Nowadays, there's companies coming out with delivery of oxygen where it's monitoring certain things and doing the calculation for you. But regardless, it has to be calculated. And according to this formula, DO2, delivery of oxygen, is the blood flow or the cardiac output or your perfusion blood flow times the oxygen content of the blood. And so looking at this in more of a mathematical way, DO2 is blood flow times what is the oxygen content of the blood. That's the oxyhemoglobin, amount of oxygen the hemoglobin is carrying, plus whatever oxygen dissolved in the plasma. And of course, hemoglobin carries huge amount of oxygen, so that makes up 90% of the equation, and what's dissolved in the plasma only makes up about 3% of the equation. So looking at this in real mathematical terms, it's delivery of oxygen is blood flow times the oxyhemoglobin portion, which is 1.36, times your hemoglobin, times your saturation of oxygen, plus the plasma dissolved portion, which is just a factor of 0.0031, times your PaO2, your partial pressure of oxygen in your arterial blood that you're sending to the patient. So what are the focus points of these parameters in this equation that we can start to simplify this so we can use it? Well, there's your equation. Delivery of oxygen is blood flow in purple there, times the hemoglobin, the oxyhemoglobin aspect of it, which is 1.36, times your hemoglobin, times your saturation of oxygen saturation, plus 0.0031 plus PaO2. So those things in purple I want you to focus on. And we're going to begin to simplify this because, see, on perfusion, I mean, any one of us who are doing even modestly diligent perfusion are going to have a pretty significant PaO2. Most people run very high PaO2 now, but certainly in the triple digits, and probably not too many people running anywhere near 150 or even 150 or above. But when you run a PaO2 in the triple digits, you're going to have an arterial saturation of 99%, and you can even use 100% for this formula pretty easily. It's not going to change anything. And then you're just down to looking at what is your hemoglobin and what is your blood flow. So, and that's what I'm saying there at the bottom. And so delivery of oxygen, though, you have to look at it as an index. In other words, you have to know how big your patient is. So you always have to look at delivery of oxygen index, which is nothing more than the delivery of oxygen formula I just stated, divided by the patient's BSA. That way you know how much to deliver to a given patient whose body surface is a given size. So then it's the same exact formula we've been talking about divided by BSA, and that gives you your delivery of oxygen index. And that's what we're going to be talking about from here forth on the lecture. How much delivery of oxygen index do we provide on bypass? Well, let's look at the normal adult at rest. Normal delivery of oxygen index for an adult at rest, and it depends on what you read. Some books say between 500 and 1,000, but I'm using here 450 to 800 because if you look at normal, a healthy adult, hemoglobin would probably be somewhere between 14 and 18. A normal at-rest adult's cardiac index, 2.8 to 4.0, maybe 4.2, a little bit higher even. Saturation for a normal person walking around is 90 to 92%, maybe 95%, but generally above 92, a little bit, and a PaO2 of about a 90 or a little bit greater. But let's look at what it is on bypass. So on bypass, our delivery of oxygen index is only 180 to 380, and this is measured, by the way, in milliliters of oxygen per minute per meter squared because it's an index. Because why is it so much lower? Well, our hemoglobins, for one thing, are much lower. They're generally between 7 and 9, right? Your blood flow is less. Cardiac indexes that most of us use are 1.8 to 2.4. Your saturation of oxygen is going to be high, greater than 99 usually. And your PaO2, as I mentioned, is going to be 150 or greater. But if you plug in a variety of these numbers, hemoglobin of 7, cardiac index of 1.8, or anything in between all those, you're going to find a range of 180 to 380. So this is why we know that our normal bypass range of delivery of oxygen is about 1/3 of what normal walking around warm body a person might be. It's pretty interesting to see how different it is. So there I'm saying it's about 35% of the at-rest DO2, largely due to our hemodilution, lower hemoglobin, and a lower blood flow index that we use on bypass. So why do we care about delivery of oxygen on bypass? Well, as we kind of said earlier, Joe, as you asked your question, it starts with the delicate state of our renal perfusion. Low PO2 levels in the medulla and a high incidence of acute kidney injury post-bypass. That's why we care about this. So let's look at regional variation in tissue oxygenation, basically in medullary hypoxia. Now, I have 4 research articles at the bottom there. I don't expect you to be able to read that, but if anybody wants to, you can. But I put those down there because I'm getting ready to give you 4 direct quotes from these various articles with regard to medullary hypoxia. One of these quotes from these articles down there is, kidney physiology and function are particularly dependent on oxygen supply. This effect is particularly pronounced in the renal medulla, where PO2 levels run as low as 10 to 25. Imagine PO2 of 10 or 15, Joe.
That's amazing. I've always been amazed by that.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. Therefore, it's not surprising that the kidney might be one of the first organs. Well, it turns out it is, but quoted here in the article, might be one of the first organs to be affected by a global reduction in delivery of oxygen. So in vitro studies have demonstrated that areas of the kidney are prone to ischemic injury in cases of even a slight reductions in renal delivery of oxygen. So this is 4 research articles I'm showing you here, why we care about delivery of oxygen and why we focused originally and still do on renal delivery of oxygen and the delivery of oxygen in the kidneys and acute kidney injury. So, Joe, this is a slide that I stole from my own lecture probably about a year ago when I was with you there in Houston, and we were talking about acute kidney injury in general and renal perfusion in general. And what we learned, and I learned and presented there at that talk, was there's a regional variation in the tissue oxygenation of the kidney. Okay, and the blood flow to the renal parenchyma, the tissue, is inhomogeneous. So what are we talking about? The high renal blood flow is first directed to the cortex to optimize filtration and reabsorption, meaning it's going to go, when you send perfusion to the kidney, it's going to go through the nephron first. There's no way to avoid that. Well, the incoming PO2 is about 50 when it first enters the kidney.
Wow.
But then, after it goes through the nephron, there's some oxygen, PO2, that is spent in this blood that's lost going through the nephron. If you look to the right graphic there, you'll see the bright orange-red arteries coming in. They're oxygenated, but as it leaves the nephron, it turns purple, meaning it's losing some of its O2. That's what this graphic is trying to demonstrate. So next, the renal tissues are perfused by the efferent artery, which can carry poorly oxygenated blood. Outside of when it leaves the nephron, it leaves even poorly oxygenated than it came in. This is why we have borderline tissue hypoxia in the parenchyma of the tissue. This effect is most pronounced in the medulla, where PO2 levels run, as I said earlier, from 10 to 25. This is normal physiology, by the way. So how much DO2 is adequate for cardiopulmonary bypass? Now, this talk gives a tribute to the early and current. These guys are still publishing a lot of papers and giving a lot of talks, but these guys really have to be tributed as the original pioneers of delivery of oxygen. In particular, the top one there, Dr. Ranuzzi in Italy, but right along with him, Dr. Philip de Sommer and Trenton Magruder here in the States. A lot of them have collaborated together. We're going to look at a lot of the papers that these guys have written, and we'll see why this is such an important topic. So what has the goal-directed perfusion research, a lot of it from these 3 gentlemen I just mentioned, what has it taught us regarding delivery of oxygen on bypass? So here's a Ranuzzi paper, goal-directed perfusion. They took, and this was published not long ago, year 2018 in Journal of Thoracic Cardiovascular Surgery, They took 326 bypass patients, and this was at 9 different institutions. That's another thing about these gentlemen's publications, Joe. A lot of them are high volume, and a lot of them are multi-institution. So that's why people put a lot of credibility in the research that these guys have published. So this is one study back in 2018. Go ahead. And the purpose of this study was to determine whether a goal-directed perfusion strategy aimed at maintaining an oxygen delivery of greater than 280 reduces the incidence of acute kidney injury. Now, this 280 is a number now that we know nowadays is a pretty strong number that gives us good results. Back 20 years ago when they started doing this research, we were searching for that level, and we pretty much honed in on it, being pretty close to that. So this is a 2018, and they kind of know that this is a really near our borderline of good delivery of oxygen and perhaps poor delivery of oxygen. But they're doing a study here, multi-institutions, 9 with 326 patients, and that's their purpose, to see, again, can we reduce the incidence of AKI with this delivery of oxygen strategy.
And just to clarify, that slide, it may be a typo, it says DO2, but because it's milliliters per minute per meter squared, that's actually a DO2I, is that right?
Oh, yeah, right. It's
Okay.
always going to be DO2I now. So if I've made a typo, I appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem.
So what they did, they had a goal-directed group, perfusion, goal-directed, of a delivery of oxygen, which they were going to maintain, and they did, of greater than 280. That was the strategy. And then the regular perfusion group that we normally perfuse patients with, and they just called it the perfusion strategy group. And this was based on what most of us do, is perfusion was based on body surface area and temperature. So what were the results? The goal-directed perfusion group, the one that had greater than 280 delivery of oxygen index, had an AKI reduction of 67% compared to the perfusion strategy group.
That's impressive.
So here's Magruder, one of the gentlemen I mentioned also. This is 2015, anal-thoracic surgery, and they were looking at the nadir oxygen delivery, the minimum oxygen delivery on bypass, and they also looked in terms of hypertension, but if it increased kidney injury risk after cardiac operations, and they took 170 bypass patients, and they matched them with a one-to-one propensity matching score. And if anybody doesn't really know what that means, they matched the patients for similar preoperative risks, similar age group, similar surgery, similar bypass times, and so on. Similar strategies as much as possible. And their purpose was to see what is the nadir, or what is the lowest oxygen delivery index on bypass that, again, indicates a risk factor for acute kidney injury. And so they actually looked back on their patients on this particular study, and they matched these patients one-to-one, so it's basically the same subgroup of patients, and they looked back and they found 85 patients, bypass patients, who developed AKI, and then they looked at 85 patients matched again one-to-one who did not, and they were trying to see, well, what was the difference here, and was the difference anything to do with delivery of oxygen? So in the non-AKI group, the group that did not develop acute kidney injury, 85 patients, versus an AKI group that did, 85 patients also. What did they find out? Well, they found out that the non-AKI group had a delivery of oxygen index on bypass over 230 milliliters per oxygen per minute per meter squared. The AKI group, who did develop AKI, averaged a 208 milliliters of oxygen index on bypass. The 30-day mortality of the non-AKI group was 5.9%, but the 30-day mortality of the AKI group, Joe, 35.3%. They found that there exists a threshold of 230 in this particular study for the development of AKI in cardiac surgery. So DeSommer and his colleagues, again, one of the gentlemen I mentioned, oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide production, which also another aspect of this you can look at is the production of carbon dioxide that's produced by the tissues during bypass as determinants of acute kidney injury. And again, it's a goal-directed study. 359 cardiac patients they took. This is back in Critical Care Journal of 2011. Their purpose was explore the association between bypass delivery of oxygen and production of carbon dioxide and how that relates to AKI. So a little bit more of a elaborate study also looking at carbon dioxide. It was a retrospective analysis, but it was a multi-center study, 359 patients analyzed. They looked at creatinine levels and their AKI development post-operatively. So what were their results? They identified a patient group with a minimum later delivered oxygen index of below 262 milliliters oxygen per minute per meter squared. Those that were above this threshold had an AKI incidence stage 2 of 7.4%. But those that were below this threshold had a 23% incidence of AKI stage 2. And this was accurate to a predictive value of 92.5%, which is pretty strong. So Ranuzzi, again, he's another paper here in 2005. And as I said, these guys have been doing this since about 2000, very late 90s, going on 20 years now. A lot of data that they've given us over those years. And he's looking at oxygen delivery during bypass and, again, acute renal failure after coronary operations. They took 1,048 consecutive cardiac surgery patients, okay, working under the premise that poor oxygenation of the renal medulla, as we discussed, during bypass may cause renal injury. They proposed that the detrimental effects may be reduced by increasing the oxygen delivery. So this is all lining up as we've been talking. Their method was they indexed the lowest delivery of oxygen on bypass and incidence of acute renal failure. So what were their results? They identified a threshold of 272 for the development of acute renal failure. So delivery of oxygen index above this threshold, those that got perfusion of 272 and above only had a 9% incidence of ARF with a 1.7% mortality rate, ARF being acute renal failure. But a delivery of oxygen index below this was a 2 to 6-fold increase and an 11% mortality rate. Magruder, again, in a pilot goal-directed perfusion initiative, looking at acute kidney injury again after bypass. This is not too old of a study, Journal of Thoracic Cardiovascular Surgery, 2017. 172 patients with a 1-to-1 propensity matching score. What was the purpose? The goal-directed study to determine if a DO2 index of 300 would decrease the incidence of postoperative creatinine and acute kidney injury. So, you know, why are they using slightly different numbers? We're through the 20 years, we're trying to hone in on that exact line in the sand that this has shown evidence more and more and more of where we should be always above and where we need to not go below. So they've tried different numbers, 230 you saw, 262, 272, here's 300. And the data comes together here closer to the end of this talk where you can be pretty sure where that real good line in the sand is, and we're going to talk about that. So go back, Joe, I'm sorry. So they looked at 300, that's what they did, and they took 88 control patients that their delivered oxygen index was 240 and 88 where their delivered oxygen index was 300. So they really wanted to see a clear difference. If there was a clear difference, and the results were in the control group, the average creatinine went up 22% and a post-op acute kidney injury incidence of 24%. In the goal-directed group, average creatinine only went up 9%, and they had a 9% incidence of acute kidney injury. So what does all of this mean? What is the accepted threshold minimum for delivery of oxygen index on bypass? And these are the 4 papers that I just discussed and reviewed for you. And you can see there, and those papers are listed at the bottom there in fine print. Click that clicker one more time, Joe, and you'll see that this is the accepted threshold that most people use nowadays. Really somewhere right in there is the sweet spot, 262 to 272, that if you always keep your delivery of oxygen index above that, if you're going to do goal-directed perfusion, you're going to see a pretty significant improvement in your AKI. And by the way, other ischemic-related complications will be reduced also. So to be safe, what a lot of people do now is to err a little bit on the side of caution, is they go ahead and use that 272 that Ranuzzi described back some years ago. So now we can look at some other things now, getting more in the weeds on this a little bit. I don't want to get too much, but I do have a few papers here. And some people look at, well, is there even something more now that we're onto this, delivery of oxygen index, and it's indicating so strongly, some of the improvements that we're seeing in AKI and other things. Maybe there's some other things we can uncover here. And the thought is, maybe the amount of carbon dioxide produced by the body is also a strong indicator, maybe even a stronger indicator. So there's a lot of research that's gone into that. And so in the human body, carbon dioxide is formed from the metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, amino acids, and is the waste product of cellular respiration. The body gets rid of excess CO2 during exhalation. Well, we pretty much know that, right? But at rest, with a tidal volume of 500, humans exhale approximately 20 milliliters of carbon dioxide per breath, or a production of carbon dioxide of approximately 240 milliliters per minute at 12 breaths a minute. So the reason I go over that is because we're going to look at what we're looking for on our patients. And so what is a carbon dioxide production index? It's the production of carbon dioxide produced per minute, of course, divided by the BSA. So let's say you have the 240, what I just discussed, of a normal healthy adult, and your BSA is 2.0, you divide that. So in normal breathing, 100 to 120, which would be the 2 divided by the 140. But produced on routine bypass, we get a carbon dioxide production of only about 32 to 50. So we're going to keep those numbers in mind, that 32 to 50 in particular on bypass as we go through this.
Is that because you're paralyzed under general anesthesia? You're not doing anything.
You know how we were only delivering about 30 to 40% of the delivery of oxygen index on bypass versus awake? It's going to go down as well with your production of carbon dioxide as well. So what has the goal-directed research studies taught us regarding carbon dioxide production index? So the reason this is important is that what we're trying to do here is, like, ideally, Joe, what we would have is some type of probe that we could, slap on our venous line or something and get a live second-to-second reading of our lactate. Right, that's what we really like to know, because if we're not producing any lactate, our perfusion in all likelihood is very adequate. If we are producing lactate, we'd like to know about it right away so we can make immediate corrections. Well, we don't have such a device, right? So we're looking for other ways where we can get immediate, as quick as possible, and as reliably as possible, indications that we're immediately starting to malperfuse and produce lactate. That's what we're really trying to get to here. So this known predictors of hyperlactatemia is greater than 3. That's a number that we usually use during bypass. So if you look at carbon dioxide production index produced on routine bypass, so carbon dioxide production index is usually greater than 60. But on bypass, as I said, 32 to 50 is what we're going to be looking at. So there's something called a respiratory quotient, where we can take the production of carbon dioxide and divide it by our consumption of oxygen. This just gives our respiratory quotient, right? So how much oxygen we're consuming and how much carbon dioxide we are producing gives us something called the respiratory quotient. And for simplicity, you can remember it as it needs to be greater than 1. But if you really scientifically look at it, specifically, the line in the sand is 0.9, but you can kind of think of it simply as also just being 1 to 1. So it's calculated from the ratio of the carbon dioxide. And here I show you in an oxygen. And so I show you here in yellow, and this is just a slide I pulled off that demonstrated what I want to demonstrate. So just look at the yellow there, the top one. The respiratory quotient is the volume of carbon dioxide produced divided by the oxygen consumed over time. And if you look at the second yellow box there, simplified equation is, for example, aerobic respiration of glucose. It takes 6 oxygen molecules, and you end up with 6 carbon dioxide molecules, again, getting you that 1-to-1 ratio, as I was just mentioning. So there in blue at the bottom, the respiratory quotient for this reaction is 6 and 6, which basically is 1, as I was sort of saying a minute ago. So that's how they get that. So your oxygen consumption and your carbon dioxide production is balanced, which would make sense in normal hemodynamics. So what has the goal directed perfusion taught us now with carbon dioxide index? Well, these known predictors, greater than 3 millimeters of hyperlactate, CO production greater than 60, our respiratory quotient of 0.9 or 1. And then the bottom one, delivery of oxygen to carbon dioxide production ratio, DO2 versus carbon dioxide production. And this turns out to be, needs to be less than 5. Less than 5 meaning we're not producing lactate. And so these 4 things we're going to look at on a couple studies. I know this is getting kind of involved, but they're really looking to see if we can even do better than looking at our delivery of oxygen. And so the example of that, go back one second, Joe. That example there at the bottom, delivery of oxygen versus CO2 production. So how do we get that? So let's say, we already know that we need to be delivering over 272, but in the example there, let's say you're delivering 300 milliliters of oxygen and your carbon dioxide production needs to be, 30 to 50. Well, here I just put 40, and you can see that that ratio is 7.5. And so that's what we need to be. We need to be, above that 5.0 level. So DeSommer, Renuzzi, these guys collaborated on another paper here. This is in August 2011, Critical Care Magazine, or Critical Care Journal. Their purpose was to analyze correlation between oxygen delivery and carbon dioxide production, which I was just mentioning, on bypass, and see how those affected our postoperative AKI. Retrospective analysis, 359 patients, 2 institutions, monitored creatinine levels and AKI stage 1 and 2. So their results were they found that there was a definite cutoff at delivery of oxygen index of 262 or greater, and that delivery of oxygen consumption of carbon dioxide ratio needed to be greater than 5.3.
I'm sorry.
And that was a predictive accuracy of 90%. So go ahead there. Yep. So in this study, same study, knowing that, actually this is a different study, I'm sorry. So Renuzzi, another study, anaerobic metabolism during bypass, what are our predictive values of carbon dioxide type derived measures? This goes back in 2006 when they were really hot on the trail of delivery of oxygen, but wanted to see if maybe there were other things. So keeping these 4 parameters in mind that I was talking about. Go ahead, Joe. Their purpose was to identify other predictors of hyperlactatemia during bypass. And this gets in the weeds a little bit, so don't get too hung up on this, but they looked at a whole bunch of different series of derived parameters of oxygen and carbon dioxide measured during bypass, and really searching to see if they could find even a better indicators of production of lactate on bypass. So prospective study of 54 patients, they sampled their lactate levels, and then they also did all these calculations of delivery of oxygen and carbon dioxide consumption. And I think it's going to run down some things here. So they put in the patient's age, gender, weight, BSA, bypass time, and they made many samples throughout the bypass run. And they looked at arterial PO2 and arterial SATs and arterial CO2. They did the same thing for venous PO2 and venous SAT and venous PCO2. They looked at hemoglobin, lactate levels, what your sweep and gas flow was, what your pump flow rate was. They also looked at the exhaled carbon dioxide from the oxygenator, your ECO2, and they utilized a capnograph. It gets kind of hairy with the capnograph. I'm not going to get into that too much. It gets difficult because a lot of the oxygenators nowadays are multi-vented. All your CO2 doesn't necessarily come out of the exhaust port. But anyway, as they found, they selected to do this. They used a calculation, and if you want to know how you calculate the carbon dioxide production, there's the calculation for you. I'm not going to get too involved with that, but that's not too difficult calculation. So using this data, they used these oxygen and carbon dioxide variables. This is what they calculated. As I said, it's a bunch of things, but go ahead, Joe's kind of runs down here.
I'm sorry.
They looked at AVO2 content difference. They looked at O2 consumption index. There's a calculation for that. They looked at the delivery of oxygen index, which we've been talking about. They kept that in there, of course. They looked at something called an oxygen extraction ratio. They looked at veno-arterial PCO2 differences, delivery of oxygen and CO2 consumption indexes, as we talked about, the respiratory quotient, as we talked about as well. So what did they find? They didn't find there was any correlation between PO2s, venous sats, cross-clamp times, or body surface area with the patients. But they did find some significant correlation between lactate production and these following things, which is what they were trying to do. They did find that the longer the pump run, you did tend to increase your lactate production just on CPB duration alone. Using the carbon dioxide index production and the oxygen delivered index, they found that there was a relationship there, and also in the respiratory quotient that we talked about, there was definitely correlation there. And this slide, don't let it get confusing. It can get a little confusing, but basically here are some more of their results. And they found patients that produced less than a lactate of 3, and they found patients that produced over 3, and they show you here what the correlations were on some of these. Bypass times, as the bypass time went up, they didn't really indicate an exact number as to where the line in the sand would be, but they found patients largely had an average bypass time 69 minutes when they had lactates greater than 3, and the ones below that tended not to. That's not an absolute. The carbon dioxide production index, remember this is what we want to have above 60, or greater than 60 is an indicator of lactate production. You can see the patients that did not produce lactate there on the left column, their average was 51, whereas patients that were above that 60, like as an average of 82, those patients were producing lactate. So that was a good indicator. The respiratory quotient, remember that's the one that we want to keep below 9. If it's above 0.9 or 1, it's going to be producing lactate, and they found that. The patients on the column on the left didn't produce lactate, had lower than 0.9, which was 0.77 on average, and the patients that did had an average of 1.35 on this respiratory quotient index that they. And then the delivery of oxygen versus the CO2 consumption, this is the one that if it's greater than 5.3, we want to keep it above 5.3. You didn't have lactate if you were, and you did if you went below that. See there, 4.1 there. Okay, so what I did now, to get back to a little bit more something we can wrap our heads around, here's a graphic on the left. It's acute kidney injury, the rate of acute kidney injury, and on the bottom is our nadir delivery of oxygen on bypass, our minimum delivery of oxygen index on bypass. And I put a red line there on this graph, and if you see where the red line is, it's our delivery of oxygen index right about the 269, 270 or so, 260 or so mark. And look to the left of that. Look at your AKI rate on those dots and variance lines there. 20, 25, 30. And then when you get to near that 260 or so delivery of oxygen index, looks how it drops down to 5. And then as you get higher delivery of oxygen indexes, it pretty much holds near that 5 or 10, with some studies varying along the way, of course. Here is the acute kidney injury rate on the y-axis on the left, with your nadir delivery of oxygen consumption of carbon dioxide ratio. Remember, this is the one that we want to keep greater than 5.3. If you look where I drew the red line, right about the 5.3 line or so, look at to the left how high the acute kidney injury is. 25, 30, 35. As soon as you get close to that 5.0, 5.3, and to the right, the acute kidney injury stays down 5, 10%. So here is acute kidney injury on the y-axis again, looking at our nadir delivery of oxygen indexes that we've been talking about so much. And there you go on the acute kidney injury on the first one there. If you have a less than 262, your acute kidney injury is 15 to 30%. When you get above 262, it drops way down between 5 and 10%. What about that delivery of oxygen versus carbon dioxide consumption, the one that we want to keep, 5 to 5.3. When you get below 5.3, it jumps 10 to 25%. You keep it above 5.3, and you're down to the 5-10% range. So these early pioneers, what have we learned from them? What have they told us? Let's bring this all back together and put together some bullet points. They demonstrated that when delivery of oxygen during bypass falls below a critical level, and we're accepting that level now to be 262 to 272, organ hypoxia is triggered when you get below this, with consequent tissue acidosis leading to increased carbon dioxide production, and that this mechanism may be a determinant of impaired postoperative renal function. Number two, they demonstrated that in hypoxia, cellular metabolism becomes anaerobic, and the ensuing acidosis, the result of the production of hydrogen ions within the cells, produces carbon dioxide via the carbonic acid buffer system. I'm going to point this out how this works in a minute. Go ahead, Joe. So what's happening is that we produce more carbon dioxide in anaerobic metabolism because of the acidosis. So if you look at the carbonic acid, carbonic formula, right? This is our buffer. When you have a lot of hydrogen ions, acid, coming in on the left side of the equation, it drives the equation to the right, producing a lot of carbon dioxide. That's why we have to keep that carbon dioxide level. Remember, it was supposed to be, less than 60, between 30 and 50. I said when it goes higher than that, it's an indication that we're producing acidosis anaerobically, okay? And that's what this formula is telling you. Go ahead, Joe. So now, number three, they demonstrated that production of carbon dioxide rises above 60, what I was just saying, in the setting of inadequate delivery of oxygen, and that an escalating anaerobic metabolism is occurring, and elevated lactates will very likely ensue. They demonstrated that in hypoxia, cellular carbon dioxide production versus oxygen consumed, defined as that respiratory quotient I was talking about, has a critical threshold of 0.9, and that any respiratory quotient greater than that is highly predictive of anaerobic metabolism, and elevated lactate levels will ensue. And I think there's a number 5 there. They also demonstrated that delivery of oxygen to CO2 production ratio, that's the DO2 to VO2 we're talking about, has a critical threshold of less than 5.3, and any value less than that is indicative of inadequate oxygen delivery. It results in increased production of carbon dioxide through anaerobic metabolism. So here's an example. Remember our cutoff, or a level we want to be above, delivering oxygen index of 270. Well, here's an example I put with the happy face there. You're delivering 320, well above. Your carbon dioxide production is well below that 60 at 40, and you're very happy, and your number there is 8, well above the 5.3. Let's say you're only delivering 240, the unhappy face there. You're only delivering 240 delivery of oxygen, and your carbon dioxide production is way up at 60. Therefore, you get the number of 4. So you get below that 5.3, it's a very good indicator of inadequate perfusion and perhaps lactate production. So Bob Groom did a lot of work on this, Joe, and he's been on top of this for a number of years. Here's a paper he wrote in 2017. But before he did this, in part of his paper, he took a little quick ad hoc survey, non-scientific, he claims it himself. And he asked people, perfusionists, as many as he could, do you measure venous oxygen saturation levels during bypass? And 85% of us, at least in his survey, do measure SVO2 on bypass, venous oxygen saturation. He asked, do you routinely measure carbon dioxide production index during bypass? And not too many people do that. I don't think I ever have. And I think it's a calculation anyway. 9% of perfusionists actually said that they do measure that index, however. He also asked, do they routinely measure PO2 levels during adult venous PO2 levels during adult bypass? And 71% of perfusionists measure PO2 on bypass. Some people don't take a venous blood gas, Joe. In fact, that's not terribly uncommon. That if everything's fine, they won't take a venous blood gas. So without that, you really can't measure your PO2 too easily. I suppose the CDI might give you that number. He also asked, do you routinely measure serum lactate levels on bypass? I know, Joe, this is an interesting topic for you. You've been talking about it recently. 43% of perfusionists, according to his ad hoc survey, said they do measure serum lactate levels on bypass. So let's look further at what his study has to do with, though. And they created at his institution a care plan that estimates delivery of oxygen based on the patient's hematocrit. So what they do is they enter in some parameters, the procedure, patient's age, height, weight, hematocrit, and they this generates a table, basically a chart, that indicates the flow that's needed at different hematocrits to maintain that delivery of oxygen index above that 270 level that we've been talking about. And they actually have here, if you look in yellow, I highlighted in yellow, and what they do is they put in the patient's, height and weight, and they get the BSA and whatnot, but then it generates what the blood flow needs to be there in yellow, what it needs to be at certain hematocrits. So they can just look at it during the case. If their hematocrit is 20%, they need to flow 5.32 to keep that delivery of oxygen above that 272 level. If their crit jumps up to say, 28%, they're at the bottom, they don't need to flow the 5.3. They can flow down the 3.88, and they'll still be flowing the delivery of oxygen index of the 272. But they take this a little bit further, Joe. They actually have developed a monitor where it gives them real-time numbers. And since that monitor is kind of hard to read, I put it there in pink there on the right so you can see it better. But this is giving them real-time, on-pump, real-time data of your delivery oxygen index. That's the 303.94. By the way, way above the 272 here in this case. The consumption of carbon dioxide index, that's the one that we want, less than 50, 30 to 50. Theirs is 45, so you're not producing excess carbon dioxide, meaning you're not in anaerobic metabolism. And then at the bottom there, delivery of oxygen index versus carbon dioxide production index. That's the one we want to have greater than 5.3. And you can see here, Bob's doing 6.16. So this is redundant, reaffirming indications, real-time monitoring that they've set up at their institution. And you have every reason to believe you are solidly not in anaerobic metabolism and not most likely producing lactate. And just real quick, they also have their monitor generates this chart. And if you look there, I just put in yellow the average. I think across the top there, for example, midway through DO2I, that's your delivery of oxygen index. If you look down in yellow, 294, well above the 272. They also have their you see, it's hard. It's kind of blocked out on my thing. That VO2 next to delivery of oxygen index, VO2 versus DO2I. That's the one that's supposed to be above 5. It's 11.85. So you can see there again, and it gives you the maximum and minimum right above and below the yellow, the maximum minimum that they hit during the procedure. But the yellow one is telling them what they average throughout the case. On top of that, real live chart that they have there. So that's pretty much all I have there, Joe.
Wow.
Thank you so much.
That was what's that? Feedback.
A lot of information.
That was a very comprehensive review. Absolutely. I heard myself through the speaker. I didn't know what it was. But that was really good. I have a ton of questions. If anybody has any questions, let's open the phone. Oh, you got the phone lines open already? That's perfect. So one of the first things I want to talk about is, and you've discussed this, I learned this from you actually, that hypothermia for the kidney doesn't help you. And so when you look at these total flows that we need, you can't take hypothermia into the equation if you are looking specifically at the kidney.
Right. Let me preface this by indicating to you that everything that this goal-directed perfusion that I just covered did not discuss two things. It did not depend, your delivery of oxygen did not depend on temperature. It did not depend on blood pressure. Blood pressure is not even in the equation for delivery of oxygen. So two interesting things. So regardless of what temperature you're at, you need to deliver according to what your hematocrit is. You're not delivering oxygen if your hematocrit is low and your flow hasn't been compensated up. So with the kidney, this is critical. This is critical for two reasons. One, the main important reason is what I kind of was saying. Hopefully it was clear on the renal slide there, where the kidney works. Unfortunately, it doesn't have two different circulations. It doesn't have like our lungs, where it has a pulmonary circulation and a bronchial circulation. It has one, and it's in series. So the more blood that you pump to the kidneys, it first all has to go through the nephrons. And the nephrons will do the work of filtration, reabsorption, secretion, and excretion. And that costs a lot of ATP. That costs a lot of energy. So it's like this. It's like a package sorting plant, which I said in my previous lecture with this. Imagine the guys over at FedEx that have to sort all those boxes. What happens? The more boxes, the busier they are at Christmas time or whatever, right? Those sorters, like the nephrons, have to work even faster. So the more perfusion you give the kidney, there's no luxurious perfusion when it comes to the kidney. The more blood flow you give it, the faster and harder the nephrons have to work, because they have to process all that, and it costs ATP. When the blood supply leaves the nephron, then it goes on to perfuse the tissue of the kidney, and that PO2 is always going to be lower than what it came in with on the nephron, because as I showed on that one slide, it costs some oxygen to do some of this, right? So unfortunately, there's no way to perfuse the kidney and get around going through the nephron. So you need to always deliver a certain level of delivery of oxygen to the kidneys. Otherwise, you have no room for air in the kidneys. The PO2 is already so incredibly low. Mm-hmm. But well, that's the way it exists.
I do feel that the kidneys have been, to some degree, treated like, I guess I can say this online. I think I can. Like bastard children that aren't as thought of. And AKI is going to, especially if they go into acute renal failure, the cost to the patient, of course, is huge. The institution, and if they end up with end-stage disease, but their length of stay in the ICU, like the stay in the hospital, need for dialysis, all of those things are very stressful for the patients. And I do feel like we have I think we have two things in cardiac surgery: an unacceptably high stroke rate. Even though it's quite low, it's not as low as our mortality rate. Most people feel like a stroke is a fate worse than death, and especially the elderly population, and maybe at higher risk. But the kidney, our acute kidney injury, acute renal failure numbers are, I believe, unacceptably high. They're higher than the stroke rate, and I think that in cardiac surgery, those are the two frontiers that I think we really need to be addressing over the next, decade.
Yeah, I would encourage people who watch PerfWeb, perfusioneducation.com, your program. I want to say maybe it was PerfWeb 23, don't hold me to that. When we talked, I think the whole program practically was dedicated to this acute kidney injury on post-cardiopulmonary bypass topic. And it's pretty amazing. Part of the reason why the real research shows it's very high, actually, incredibly high. The only time you find papers that say it's not all that high is because they're not defining it correctly. And that was a big problem for many years. But now there's established clear definitions for what constitutes AKI. And when you really go by that, you're going to find, if you're, be pretty surprised how high a lot of centers find that their incidence of AKI actually is. Now, a lot of it may get resolved later in the ICU, but the damage is pretty serious. The kidneys have no tolerance for any decrease of the PO2 that they're already living on. They live right on the edge.
Yeah, AKI can be maybe to some degree reversible, and maybe the AKI is not so bad that the kidneys are maybe you just live with a 0.1 or 0.2 or maybe even a 0.3 bump in your creatinine for the remainder of your life, which is not going to require dialysis. It's whether you require long-term dialysis, and this particular chronic dialysis, where it really becomes an enormous problem. A patient who ends up on dialysis with end-stage renal disease from whatever the cause may be is going to cost the healthcare system about $100,000 a year for that one treatment of that one disease. So it's very expensive, and it's also life-altering. I mean, tremendously life-altering.
One of I don't have the study in front of me, and people can look it up. One of the real unfortunate things that happens in our field in regards to this exact topic is that we do an awful lot of patients, you know, they do great, they do fine. They have a little bump, like you said, and their creatinine maybe for a few days, maybe even a significant bump, but it goes away and everybody says everything's fine. Let me tell you what happens. Later in life, as they get elderly, those patients on a very high percentage end up with renal and kidney failure much sooner than people who have not had that even mild incident of cardiopulmonary bypass even decades earlier.
Yeah, more likely, certainly more likely. There's no question about it, I think. The other thing, I'll tell you, this brings up another thing, and I have so much, but I'm going to try to limit it. If somebody wants to call in, please do so now. But this is why I get so exercised when I hear about people who run really acceptably, they accept very low hemoglobins or hematocrits on pump. And I've seen it as low as 16. And when you do cardiac surgery and you do perfusion, we basically have a big long list of things we must do so that the patient survives this procedure. But everything that we do many times to razor thin margins because they have to do the operation. We are there to facilitate them doing the operation. And many times that means we have to be running lower flows, lower pressures. There's all kinds of things that we do in order to help facilitate doing the operation, because now the clock is ticking. The clamp is on, the heart is open, they can't see. If they can't see, they can't put the stitch in right. They don't put that stitch in right, the operation will have failed and the patient is not going to survive. So there's a very fine, it's a razor thin line. And when you sacrifice oxygen carrying capacity by reducing the hematocrit so low, and therefore your oxygen carrying capacity, you are giving yourself, you're almost hamstringing yourself, in my view, or giving yourself an Achilles heel, because you have literally no room to lower your flow. You have to be at super high flows and the field is flooded, they can't do the operation. So if you're not doing that, you are definitely not perfusing enough oxygenated blood to either the tissues in general, but especially not to the kidney. And I really do believe that.
Well, these gentlemen who've been 20 years of research now, and believe me, there's a lot more than the three that I listed here that all found the same thing. And as we talked about one time before, something about like 73% of all research studies can't be duplicated by somebody else. And believe it or not, Joe, I learned the other day that 52% of research studies can't be duplicated by the same researcher. And in this particular case with delivery of oxygen, almost all of the research has been duplicated by others. They've found that there is a critical level. You may debate it a little bit, but it's really been honed in now on that 270. But, you know, everybody who's looked at this finds that if you don't deliver a certain level of delivery of oxygen, your acute kidney injury, and by the way, this can be focused on a lot of other things, but acute kidney injury is so sensitive that it's glaring and easy to track. Well,
just like you just
is critical.
Yeah, and just like, I'm sorry, go ahead. Forgive me, I thought you were done.
I mean, there's a paradigm shift hopefully underway, and it's taking way too long in our field. And I hope 5 or 10 years from now, if not sooner, really, if you want to be a better perfusionist, and you know, Joe, whenever I give a talk, I always try to find one thing a listener can take home tomorrow and say, what have I learned that I can be a better perfusionist tomorrow? You can be a better perfusionist tomorrow by stop flowing according to BSA and temperature and flow according to delivery of oxygen. Because there's so many of these crazy studies out there, there's way too many of them, that have focused on what is a nadir hematocrit. Well, we had a nadir hematocrit of 23, and below that everybody had AKI, and above that nobody did. So you just can't have a hematocrit of below 23. So as soon as the hematocrit gets below 23, we give blood. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with your delivery of oxygen and what you were flowing when you had those hematocrits below 23. You can have a lower hematocrit, you just have to flow more. Now, what you're talking about
that's
is
bad because then the kidneys have to process more blood that has a lower oxygen content, so the PO2 hitting the nephron at 30 or 25 is going, because it has less content, and no matter what, it's going to hit it at 20 instead, or 15, and now it's going to be 2 in the medulla, or lower, or 0.
Yeah, and if you're going to run low hematocrits of like some crazy thing like 16 or whatever, I mean, you better be flowing an awful high flow, and you can figure that out. But at some point is a point of no return. Maybe even then, due to other reasons, your crit's so low, you start losing your buffer capacity, and you start losing your ability to maybe
viscosity, you third space, you get it, there's all kinds of bad things that happen when you become that hemodiluted. And you look at every study done that is from the critical care side of things in the ICU, they will all tell you that fluid overload or excessive hemodilution, both, and they're independent, they're different things, but both are very bad for survival. Both of them are bad.
Yeah, very bad, yeah.
And we know that. And you were talking about goal-directed therapy. Shoemaker is kind of the guy that started that. And then Manny Rivers, I talked about him once before, and they have found that if they can take a patient that comes into the emergency department and they can increase their DO2 significantly, and they push it up to above 750 total, 750 milliliters per minute, which would be, whatever that, but higher than that, that their survival increased substantially. Now, there were downside risks. They fluid resuscitate them very rapidly because the goal is to get the cardiac output up. They need to fill the tank, so you do have fluid challenges later, but that's where treating with blood, treating with ultrafiltration, all that kind of stuff, using CVVH, which I'm a very strong proponent of, or advocate of, is very important. All of these things help. And I'm a big believer on ultrafiltration on bypass. I want the hematocrit. Look, when we have a sick case, and I'm working with a surgeon who is, we're in sync with each other. We agree with each other. They philosophically believe the same thing I do, and I've been able to work like this. I have always seen patients who came in with a low ejection fraction, a really weak, baggy heart, come up with very strong ultrafiltration and managing their oncotic pressure, making sure they weren't third spaced, in some ways almost drying their tissue out a little bit, making them slightly hyper-oncotic for a period of time, a lot of ultrafiltration, that those patients with a higher hematocrit have come off pump, and I mean 30, have come off pump fantastically when no one thought they were going to survive the basic operation. And it makes an enormous difference. I've seen it with my own eyes too many times.
Yeah, I agree. I've done a lot of cases like that too, because for many, many years, hemoconcentrator was just part of our tubing pack. It was in our circuit every day.
Ours is too. Now, ours is too in our practice, just so you know. We still believe it.
Wow. Well, you talk the old days, I'm talking about where priming volumes were large and cardioplegia was largely crystalloid, so we almost had to. But wow, I'm impressed that you're doing that, because so many people have really, gotten away from the hemoconcentrator. We talked about this in another perf web where people are demonizing it, but I'm hoping that that's coming back. I don't know that it is. It would be very hard for me to gauge that, but
I mean, it's an absurd argument.
That people are
though,
learning
John.
from these
I don't want to belabor the point, but that whole thing that's being done, and I've seen the same thing, same information you have. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to knock anyone. I'm not going to say who it is. People can look it up themselves. But it's absurd. It's an absurd argument. There's so much data. The data is exhaustive that ultrafiltration is a very beneficial thing to do, both on bypass and in the form of CRRT with a more precise methodology in the ICU, is a very beneficial therapeutic modality for patients, both to remove fluid and manage some inflammatory mediators, but definitely for fluid management in the bypass run, but then later for clearances and basically giving the kidney an opportunity to rest.
Yeah, I would encourage people to watch. I think there was a perf web that we did on that, and we hit on that a lot. And it's just overwhelming. 30, 40 years or more of data and history of using hemoconcentrator, the enormous benefits that I think people have lost sight of. They need to recapture that. They really do.
I think so too. And I just think they should look at all resources. They should go to all the resources and look all of this information up on their own as well and learn about it and be more informed and make themselves a better practitioner in doing things that are evidence-based, that have been essentially proven with legitimate randomized and controlled and case match studies, and change their practice to be more aware of these things. Our job doesn't end because the patient left the operating room with a beating heart. We want them to go to the ICU, be extubated as soon as possible, and have all of their faculties, and normally, like they normally had, their same personality, and also have functioning kidneys. Get out of the ICU as soon as possible, get out of the hospital as soon as possible, and go back to normal life. That's our job. It isn't just to get them out of the operating room. We need to stop thinking like that.
Yeah, what about the long-term effects years and decades later, like we were just talking about with regard to a slight hit to your kidneys now, but these people end up with the elder years of life and renal failure, part renal failure, and struggling with the problems that comes with, when it all comes back down to what happened to them on bypass or in the OR, or maybe even post-operatively too. There's a lot of factors for AKI for sure, but we definitely play a big role in it, and I think we should up our game with delivery of oxygen. I think those days are coming. I'm understanding that the schools, perfusion schools, are teaching this pretty heavily and have been for a handful of years. I believe. I talk to new students and they seem to, but then they go to a place as a new grad and they're not going to rattle the trees too much and tell all the older guys, hey, I'm not perfusing according to BSA and temperature, and then they fall right back into what's been done for 100 years or 50 years and don't use that information that they were taught, unfortunately.
Very true.
Someday,
Very true, very true.